So, dear students, welcome back to our anthropology class. Well, in the previous section, I had already given a very broad outlook and introduction into the theme, and then followed by preliminary remarks about philosophical anthropology. Man is a possible possibility or an impossible possibility. Then the various dimensions. Before that, well, we also spoke about three phases of the study of man: cosmocentric, theocentric, and anthropocentric. And thus we wound up the first section, and now we enter into the various dimensions developed in the history of Western philosophy. In the general introduction, we have said already, man is a historical being, therefore he is to be studied from a historical point of view and a critical study. And in the first part, we have seen cosmocentric, theocentric, anthropocentric understanding. And now we develop the various dimensions developed by different philosophers in the history of Western philosophy. So there is a little introduction into that. We know Feuerbach can be said to be the first who tried to criticize Hegel's over-spiritualistic interpretation of history, man and reality. Hegelian philosophy, the second year towards the end, you studied it. So Hegel, with his philosophical understanding, exposed an over-spiritualistic interpretation of history, man and reality. And that's being attacked by Feuerbach, or critically evaluated by Feuerbach. In Feuerbach, Hegel's spirit becomes nature. He criticized Hegel for projecting the numerous potentialities in man elsewhere in God. That was a little problem with the philosophy of Hegel. So, human potentialities or human capacities human potentialities were simply projected unto God. So, in other words, an over-spiritualistic interpretation of history. So, he criticized Hegel for projecting the numerous potentialities in man elsewhere in God or in spirit. Man projects God because man is suffering from his finiteness. That is what Feuerbach says. So, his desire for the infinite motivates man to create a being whose qualities are unlimited. Look at that sentence. His desire for the infinite motivates man to create a being whose qualities are unlimited. That being is called God. That is what Feuerbach says. Thus, projection consequently leads to alienation. Man is deprived of his essential qualities, and that is projected unto a being elsewhere. This means losing what is proper to man. Yes, man has certain proper qualities of his own, and that is projected elsewhere. That is what the opinion of Feuerbach. What is properly mine now belongs to a projected being, a creation of my imagination of God. You will study Feuerbach in the third year contemporary Western philosophy. This is the trouble with Hegel's theory. Hence, Feuerbach makes an appeal to reinstate anthropology in the place of theology. Reinstate anthropology in the place of theology. In other words, Feuerbach is proposing that the qualities placed elsewhere, please take it back. These are your qualities. This is the trouble. Hence, Feuerbach makes an appeal to reinstate. What do you mean by reinstate? To invest yourself. Instead of investing your qualities elsewhere, bring it back and keep it with you. Reinstate anthropology in the place of theology. Feuerbach himself did not formulate a systematic anthropology, but he inspired his student Karl Marx to give shape to this project. So in other words, he could not complete. He has asked his own disciple Karl Marx to give shape to his philosophy. Now, before coming to Karl Marx, you know Hegel's notion of reality. Once you understand it, you will understand Karl Marx in a better way. What is the Hegelian notion of reality? According to him, reality is in a process. Reality is in a process. Contradiction is the root of life. Contradiction is at the root of life, which you have already seen in your second year towards the end. I am only just recapping it here to understand Karl Marx better. Also seen Karl Marx. Therefore, it is easy for you now. So, reality is in a process. Contradiction is the root of life, and reality is idea, reason, or spirit. So, this is Hegel's understanding of reality. And now, Feuerbach is proposing that the qualities of man placed elsewhere, please bring it back to human being himself. And that task of formulating a new theory is entrusted to his disciple Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx, taking the basic concepts from Hegel, develops a philosophical anthropology. And now, Hegelian notion is that reality is in a process, contradiction is the root of life, and reality is idea, reason, or spirit. Now, what does Karl Marx do? Karl Marx is in agreement with the first premise, namely that reality is in a process. Contradiction is the root of life. Well, no problem. But then the next point is something slightly different. Yes, according to him, yes, reality is no longer idea, reason, or spirit, but rather replaces reality with matter. So reality is in a process, contradiction is at the root of life, and reality is matter. Thus, dialectical idealism of Hegel becomes dialectical materialism. Materialism of Karl Marx. So, in other words, matter becomes of utmost importance. Why I said so much is that you have already seen in your second year Karl Marx, but then we won't be going to elaborate Karl Marx completely, but rather only just take out his notion of man. Now, rest I will just read it out for you because you have already seen in your second year. Karl Marx developed his philosophy of man, basing his entire thought on the concept of labor. And man is understood in terms of labor. Labor is for him the touchstone of self-realization. Yes, man as a labor. Man is defined as a labor. Now, this is the touchstone. What does it mean, touchstone? Yes, the goldsmith on a stone rubs and sees the quality of gold. The same way, labor is the touchstone with the help of which man is understood or defined by Karl Marx. And the rest of it you have already seen. Yes, man is a labor and is a worker. And what does he do by his work? In work, two things happens. What are they? Yes, you realize yourself, and then you humanize the nature. So, a realization of yourself takes place, and then thereby with your work you humanizes the nature. And these two aspects of life is interconnected in the sense at the moment you work, you realize yourself. At the same time, with your work, you humanizes the nature. And it goes on, you know, completely the philosophy of Karl Marx, which you have already written for your exam and you already secured your marks. At the same time, well, we just refresh it here so that you understand what is his notion of man. This is from the anthropological perspective that we learn or we look at him now. Human labor transforms the objective reality into a human reality. Labor is a factor which mediates between man and nature, and consequently both are transformed. Human being is transformed. What happens? He realizes his worth and then he humanizes the nature. Human labor transforms the objective reality into a human reality. This work of man is man's self-expression, and by it he develops himself and becomes himself. Now this work of an individual has a communitarian dimension too. Yes, man is not just a worker, he is also a fellow worker. Yes, mitsein, with others as a fellow worker. As a fellow worker, they work together. So in other words, man's concern for the worker is not limited to a particular person, but it reaches to the whole of society. Hence, it follows that ultimately victory is achieved through solidarity among the working class or the proletariat, which you have already studied. A man is more of a human being when he is bound with others to achieve his realization. All that is man's labor and all that is. So he defines man as a worker. That is what is all important. This is one of the dimensions developed in the history of Western philosophy. Man as a worker. Now, viewing man from his understanding, he discovers that the very day man of his time is alienated. The very man of his time was alienated. Why? Yes, he doesn't get what he works, or in other words, in proportion to the way he works, he doesn't get his reward because he is in the capitalist society and all that is. But then our purpose here is that his the dimension developed by Karl Marx is called man as a worker. And now, well, we need also to just probably in the second year you may not have gone into the negative aspects of Karl Marx philosophy. Therefore, we need also to, we need to critically evaluate this dimension developed by Karl Marx. Now, what is that? That is what we are going to see now. It's true that Marx's understanding of man has socio-political, economic relevance and significance. There's no doubt regarding that. There is socio-political, economic relevance, Karl Marx's notion. But then there are certain major defects of his thinking, or in other words, we can point out certain negative aspects of his thinking. Okay. It is not without negative consequences. The first consequence of Marx's materialist concept of man is the denial of any essential difference between matter and mind. The first point is denial of any essential difference between matter and spirit, or matter and mind. Spirit means also mind. So it doesn't make a distinction. And that is, well, if you define man as a worker, and that is only perhaps one dimension of life is the work. There are various other elements in human beings. So in other words, the denial of any essential difference between matter and mind. In such an understanding, Marx failed to give importance to the role of consciousness, failed to give importance, yes, to one of the very important aspects, consciousness, importance to the role of consciousness, the capacity to transcend the material, the capacity to transcend the material. Yes, man lives not only by bread alone. Yes, in other words, even if we have plenty, well, the mind will be searching for something beyond. So in other words, Karl Marx failed to give importance to the role of consciousness. In other words, the capacity of human being to transcend the material. So in other words, he tied the whole notion of man into the matter. He is pure matter-like. So that is the second point. And then consequently, well, we can talk about the denial of freedom. Yes, even if everything is there, man is in search of something beyond, and that denial of freedom. Again, Marx should have discovered the influence of consciousness in man and should have integrated this dimension in his understanding of man. So in other words, yes, the consciousness, the aspect of consciousness and its influence in human life in searching for higher values of life was forgotten. Therefore, this denial of any essential difference between matter and mind, he failed to give importance to the role of consciousness and the capacity to transcend materialism. So, well, slowly we come to a very big statement about the defect of his philosophy that will sum up everything in a different way. Marx should have discovered the influence of consciousness in man and should have integrated this dimension in his understanding of man. Finally, Marx's materialistic vision of man did not give adequate importance to human nature in a personal sense. Yes, human nature in a personal sense. And this is something very important. Yes, each of us is born in space and time with all qualities, but then reduce everyone into a worker and then only limit everyone with that aspect is a very dangerous aspect. In other words, the higher values in man, his consciousness, his capacity to transcend himself, and much more his capabilities, talents, vibrant nature is all forgotten. In other words, a personal sense of a man, yes, is forgotten. Therefore, Marx's materialistic vision of man did not give adequate importance to human man. Finally, his vision of man did not give importance to the nature in a personal sense. Man is understood only in relation to society as a worker. We can note that the Marxian understanding of man is not an integral one. Not integral. Is simply a partial view. It has not taken into various elements. In spite of its positive contributions, it remains to be partial and biased. Partial and biased. Biased means what? Partial means what? It's only something like you see it one dimension, only one dimension. The other aspects are forgotten. So that is the first understanding, man dimension, namely man as a worker. So you go through also your second year class notes and try to take the important elements from there, but then don't forget this criticism. So when we are looking into the various dimensions developed in the history of Western philosophy regarding man, anthropology, well, we find the first dimension developed by Karl Marx. Karl Marx, namely man, a worker. Okay, now we go, under, that is 2:1 Karl Marx. Now 2:2 going to be the existential man. The existential. Yes, here I would like also to tell the third year philosophy students that you have already classes uploaded. History of Western philosophy, existentialism. So you need also to study existentialism in a better way so that, well, we will be able to know what the existentialist philosophers speak about man. So we are going to now only take up the existentialism, and then what is their understanding of man. That's only what we are going to do. Existentialism in a broader sense and in the strict sense by different philosophers will be taught by another professor, and that's already classes uploaded. So kindly go through it. You will understand then my section in a better way. Now, existentialism. So, in other words, the dimension developed by the existentialist philosopher. So, in other words, the existential man. So, under chapter 2, the number 2 will be the existential man. Here we will concentrate ourselves on the reaction made by the existentialist towards Hegelian, scholastic, abstract, deterministic view of man. Soren Kierkegaard, who is known to be one of the pioneers of the existential movement in philosophizing, critically reacted to the then prevailing situation. Well, Kierkegaard is also called the father of modern philosophy. So, we are going to see the existential understanding of man, anthropology. So, that is, we start with the Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is called also the pioneer, the father of modern existential philosophy. He critically reacted to the then prevailing situation. He brought out the real dimension of to be in the real sense of an existentialist would mean, what does it mean? To stand out. To stand out. Yes, to stand out means to stand out from the crowd. From the crowd. So that is his understanding. So he brought the real dimension of to be in the real sense of an existentialist would mean to stand out, which in turn means would transcend. Yes. To transcend. Okay? To transcend oneself. He approached the human existence of his time first negatively and brought out the two negative aspects. In the first place, he found men of his time were in the crowd. Men of his time were said to be in the crowd. What happens when you are in the crowd? You don't have your voice. You don't have your opinion. You simply follow the opinion of the crowd. That's what is called a crowd mentality. So, existentialism means to stand out from the crowd, stand out from the crowd mentality, stand out from or transcend yourself from the crowd mentality. Be authentic in your existence. That's what he means. Okay, how do you reach at it? Well, for that, you have these three stages according to him. The aesthetic stage, ethical stage, and the religious stage. Well, this will be dealt at length in the history of Western philosophy, existentialism, in your third year. And probably that is already being done. Therefore, I don't have to go in details into it. Aesthetic stage, ethical stage, and the religious stage. The final stage, you get all explanation by the professor of the history of Western philosophy when he is dealing with existentialism. So, the religious man is the one who transcends, who makes a leap. In other words, he stands out and he comes out of the crowd mentality. That is all his notions. He brought out the real dimension, yes, and then transcend oneself. He approached the man of his time, first negatively, and then in the first place, he found the man of his time were in the crowd. This is to say, the crowd made decisions for the individual. The individual in the crowd is a conformist, means he simply conforms himself to the opinion of the crowd. Das man is a neuter gender in German language. Yes, crowd is a neuter gender. You don't see the face of, you only hear the voice, opinion, and that opinion is of nobody's. So that's a problem. Okay. The individual in the crowd is a conformist who is not capable of making definitive decision for himself. Decision for himself. It's not he who took the decision, used to take the decision, but the crowd took the decision. That's the distinction. So keep it in mind. Well, when you see the history of Western philosophy, existentialism, you get more light into it. Okay, the crowd made decisions for the individual. The individual in the crowd is a conformist. He fears to stand out. To be an individual would mean that he makes choices and have the courage to bear the consequences. Secondly, he also noted that men of his time were very often spectators. What happens in the crowd? When you are in the crowd, you are a spectator. Spectator means what? Yes, a man who simply goes on. Yes, what others are doing. No, you are not interested in what am I to do, but then what others do. Spectators. Kierkegaard would challenge the men of his time to be actors instead of being a spectator. You are called to be an actor. Actor doesn't mean that as if you are acting in a cinema, but then a person who is doing what you are. Yeah, do duty for its own sake and all you studied in the second year. Well, it comes here. The relevance of it. Yes. Kierkegaard would challenge the men of his time to be actors fully involved in the decisions and in the whole process of life. Negative. The negative attitude of passivity and indifference is to be overcome by being an actor involved in the process of life. So, yes, to stand out from the crowd, be not a spectator but an actor, and you need to transcend yourself and become part of the definitive decisions of one's own life. So this is something, therefore, to understand it, well, he will say the three stages of man's life, namely aesthetic. It is the aesthetic stage where man gives importance to a life of enjoyment and pleasure. Hence he lives for the moment, making the utmost as pleasure. The characteristic feature is that man in this stage is that he does not make any commitment. Kierkegaard speaks of this in a very special way. And then the ethical stage. This is characterized by laws. If in the first stage man could not make any choice, in this stage he makes a sort of commitment. It is a partial commitment to the laws of the society or religion. Here we find a law-bound individual, one who simply follows the law. But then the religious stage, the third stage, is something very important. Kierkegaard sees a man who is fully grown, who makes personal commitment for him is a commitment to Jesus in faith, Jesus of Nazareth. Here a man is led by an interior personal call and gives a personal commitment. The fully grown man for Kierkegaard is a Christian not by convention, social pleasure or heredity, but rather a Christian by a personal faith experience and commitment. So that's something very important. Kierkegaard's notion of man at that moment of choice is actually in a moment of anxiety and all that is. But then for him, the notion of man is a man who makes choice, a man who stands out, not a spectator but an actor who makes definitive choice decisions in life. Or in other words, a man who transcends the crowd or stands out and as authentic as possible. That is Karl Marx. Now, Kierkegaard, and the Kierkegaard's notion will be further developed by two philosophers that we will see it in the next class. Namely, who are they? Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Sartre. Kierkegaard's notion of an actor or a man who makes a definitive choice, a man who transcends the crowd, stands out of the crowd, is being developed further in two directions by two philosophers, namely Nietzsche and Sartre. That we will see in the next class. Thank you.